Sheriff's deputy didn't knock. He kicked the door open so hard the hinges screamed, and little Rosie Hart dropped her tin cup and pressed herself into the corner behind the wood stove, eyes wide as a spooked animal. Deputy didn't look at the child. He looked at Evelyn, at her cracked hands, her hollow cheeks, the way her dress hung off her shoulders like it belonged to a larger woman who no longer existed, and he smiled. $10, he said, slapping the tax notice on the table, hard enough to rattle the last 2 jars of preserves on the shelf. Got till Friday, Mrs. Hart. After that, we auction the land. Every stick and stone of it. He let his eyes travel slowly around the empty cabin. Of course, looking at this place, I'd say someone already took most of what it was worth. Walked out without closing the door behind him. Rosie didn't move from the corner. Evelyn didn't move either. Just stood there looking at that piece of paper while the cold February air pushed through the open doorway and the fire in the wood stove began, slowly and without mercy, to die. If you have ever stood in a room and felt the last thing holding you up disappear, you already know what Evelyn Hart felt in that moment. If this story moves you, if it reaches something real inside you, we'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us the city or country where you're watching. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now stay with us, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about desperation, pride, and what it means to be saved by the last person you expected. Evelyn Hart was 28 years old, and she had already buried a husband, a litter of pigs, 2 milk cows, most of what she'd once believed about the world being fair. Thomas Hart had been a decent man. Not a brilliant one, not a lucky one, but decent, the kind of man who fixed what was broken before he was asked and never raised his voice at the table. Come west from Ohio 6 years ago with 40 acres of land deed, young wife, 3 good animals, and the particular brand of optimism that tends to survive only in people who have not yet been tested by a Wyoming winter. The first winter tested him. The second one broke something in his chest that never quite healed. By the third, the cough had settled in for good. He died in November, 8 months before the story begins, leaving Evelyn with their daughter, their 40 acres. A horse named Winter ran a tax bill she had no earthly way to pay. 40 acres were nothing spectacular. Flat pasture land at the edge of the valley, rocky on the western side, prone to flooding in the spring melt. But the soil on the eastern quarter was dark and deep, and Thomas had always said that if they could get through enough winters, they'd have something worth having. Evelyn had believed him. She'd believed him even as she watched him fade, even as she sold the milk cows in October for enough to buy medicine that ultimately didn't work, even as she fed Rosie the last of the dried beans through December and into January while the world outside went silent under 3 feet of snow. She had one thing left of genuine value, the white stallion. Winter was Thomas's horse, technically, but horses don't think in terms of ownership. Winter had come to Evelyn's voice by the second winter, had learned to find her in the dark, and had a habit of pressing his great pale forehead against her collarbone when she stood still long enough. He was 8 years old, strong, and the most beautiful animal most people in the valley had ever seen. 3 separate ranchers had offered to buy him. Thomas had refused every time. Man sells his horse, he'd told Evelyn once, and pretty soon he's selling everything else. She had tried everything else first. She had applied for work at the general store in Dunmore, the nearest town, 6 miles east. The storekeeper, a man named Orville Pratt, had looked at her with the calculating expression of someone doing arithmetic in his head and told her he already had all the help he needed. She had offered to take in laundry from the 2 boarding houses in town. One agreed, then changed their mind when the weather made the road impassable for 3 consecutive weeks. She had written to her sister in Indiana, asking not for money, just for a loan, just enough to get through the spring, and received a letter back explaining that her sister's own family was struggling and could not help. The letter had arrived the same week as the tax notice. $10, a sum that might as well have been 1,000. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time that night. After she put Rosie to bed, looking at the tax notes and then at the small advertisement she had clipped from a newspaper 2 weeks earlier. She had found the paper wrapped around a pound of flour she'd traded 2 rabbit pelts for at Pratt's store. The advertisement was in the back pages, small type, easy to miss. She had read it 3 times, set it down, and not thought about it again for 10 days. She thought about it now. Rancher in Larder Valley, Wyoming Territory, seeks a capable woman of good character for correspondence with intent toward matrimony. Comfortable home. Stable income, respondents should write to see. Rourke, Larder Valley Post, Wyoming. She didn't spend long debating it. Well, that was the thing about genuine desperation. It strips away the time you'd normally spend being proud. She wrote the letter that same night by the last of the lamplight, while the wind pushed against the cabin walls, and Rosie coughed softly in the next room. She wrote honestly. She told him she was a widow with a 5-year-old daughter. She told him she was hard-working, that she could cook and mend and manage a household, that she was not afraid of difficult winters or hard labor. She did not tell him about the tax bill. She did not tell him about the empty shelves or the way she was stretching the last of the flour by mixing it with a little cornmeal and pretending it was the same thing. She told him what she could offer, which was honest effort and genuine intent. She sealed the letter, walked it to town the next morning through 6 inches of new snow, and paid the 2-cent postage with coins she'd been keeping in a cracked teacup on the windowsill. Then she went home and waited. The response came faster than she expected, 9 days, which was remarkably quick for a letter traveling across the Wyoming Territory in February. It was brief and direct, the handwriting of a man who wrote rarely and chose his words like he chose fence posts, for function, not ornament. Mrs. Hart, I received your letter. Your situation is understood. I have a large ranch house and sufficient means. If you are willing to travel to Larder Valley, I will arrange for your arrival. There is a room for your daughter. See Rourke. It was not a love letter. It was not even particularly warm. But it said your situation is understood, and in that moment, that was the closest thing to kindness Evelyn had received from anyone outside her own 4 walls in the better part of a year. Began making arrangements. Leaving was not simple. Cabin would need to be locked, and she worried about who might break the lock in her absence. She had no neighbors close enough to ask for a watch on the property. She packed what she could carry, Rosie's winter clothes, change of dress for herself, Thomas's pocket watch, the one thing of his she hadn't been able to bring herself to sell, though she'd come close twice, a small tin of sewing needles, and the tax notice, which she brought more out of grim habit than any clear plan. Winter she would ride. There was no money for a wagon. Morning they left, Rosie stood at the door of the cabin, looking back at the inside like she was memorizing it. She was a quiet child, Rosie, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's way of noticing things without saying them aloud. She had not asked many questions about where they were going. She had asked one, "Is this man nice?" Evelyn had looked at the letter again before answering. "Your situation is understood. I think he's trying to be," she said. Rosie had considered that for a moment with the gravity of a child who has learned not to take comfort for granted. "Okay," she said, and picked up her small bundle. They rode out of the valley in the thin gray light of early morning. Rosie settled in front of Evelyn on Winter's back, the horse moving carefully over the frozen ground, with the deliberate care of an animal that knows it is carrying something precious. Larder Valley was 43 miles northwest, which, in February, in Wyoming, was not a journey, it was an ordeal. First day went tolerably well. Road was frozen solid enough to hold Winter's weight without him breaking through the crust, and Evelyn kept them moving at a steady walk, stopping twice to let the horse rest and to let Rosie eat the cornbread she'd packed. Sky stayed flat and gray but didn't threaten snow, and by nightfall they had covered nearly 20 miles, stopping at a way station where the keeper let them sleep in the corner of the main room for 15 cents money Evelyn had taken from the teacup. Second day was harder. The temperature dropped sometime before dawn and kept dropping. By mid-morning, Evelyn couldn't feel her left foot properly and was rotating it in the stirrup to keep the blood moving. Rosie had burrowed inside Evelyn's coat as much as she could and hadn't spoken in 2 hours, which Evelyn recognized not as contentment but as the specific silence of a child who is conserving energy. Winter began to slow around midday, not dramatically, not collapsing, but with the subtle, careful slowing of an animal that has been asked to give more than it has. She found the ranch by late afternoon. She almost missed it. The sign at the road junction was weather-beaten and the name had faded, but she could make out Rourke in the peeling paint, and she turned Winter onto the long track that led down toward a cluster of buildings visible at the base of the ridge. The horse made it to the gate and then stopped, and no amount of gentle urging would move him further. Stood with his legs slightly spread and his head low. Evelyn recognized that posture. She had seen it before. Near the end, both the milk cows and something clenched hard in her chest. She dismounted, lifted Rosie down, and led Winter the remaining quarter mile to the barn. Ranch hand saw her coming. He stared from the barn doorway for a long moment before disappearing inside. By the time she reached the barn, 2 more hands had come out to look, and then the man she assumed was Caleb Rourke was walking toward her from the direction of the main house. She made herself stand straight and not show how much her legs were shaking. Taller than she'd imagined from the letter. She wasn't sure why she'd imagined anything at all, but she had a softer man, perhaps, or an older one. Kind of man who places a matrimonial advertisement because he is gentle and solitary and hasn't quite known how to find a wife through ordinary means. This man was none of those things. He was broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been worked on by weather for years, dark eyes set deep under a straight brow, and an expression that gave nothing away. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her, really looked, the way a person does when they're trying to understand a situation quickly. Eyes went to Rosie, who was holding Evelyn's hand and looking back at him with the measuring solemnity of a child who has been in too many uncertain rooms. Then they went to Winter, who was standing with his head still low, breathing in a way that was audible even from several feet away. And back to Evelyn. "Mrs. Hart," he said. It was not a question. "Rourke," she said, "I apologize for the state of things. It was a harder trip than I planned for." He didn't respond to that directly. He looked at Winter again. "How long has the horse been moving like that?" "Since midday." He turned to the nearest ranch hand, a young man with a freckled face and the look of someone who'd been standing around waiting to be told what to do. "Get Pete. Tell him to look at that horse now, not after supper." The hand went immediately. Caleb looked back at Evelyn. "When did you and the girl eat last?" She hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "This morning." It was not quite true. The cornbread had run out yesterday evening, and this morning she had given Rosie the last of the dried apple she'd been keeping in her coat pocket and eaten nothing herself. She didn't know if he caught the hesitation or simply decided not to press it. He nodded once, looked at Rosie again with an expression she couldn't fully read, and said, "Come inside." Ranch house was not what she had expected. She had imagined something reflecting wealth, thick rugs, heavy curtains, the kind of accumulated domestic comfort that suggests generations of careful keeping. What she found was large and structurally sound and almost entirely neglected. Main room had good bones, a wide fireplace, solid timber walls, windows that faced south to catch the light. The hearth had ash that hadn't been cleared in days. The table was bare and dusty, and there was a particular quality of silence to the house that came not from emptiness but from long disuse rooms that had ceased expecting anyone to enter them. A woman named Dora Finch, the only female presence on the ranch, ran the kitchen. She was a stout woman in her 50s with thick forearms and the manner of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. She produced a bowl of bean soup for Rosie without being asked, then a second one for Evelyn, and set cornbread on the table between them. Rosie ate with the concentrated urgency of a child who knows better than to let food wait. Evelyn forced herself to eat more slowly, though every instinct was against it. Caleb sat across the table and said nothing for several minutes, which Evelyn found both more comfortable and more unnerving than conversation would have been. Finally he said, "You didn't mention the child in your first letter." "I mentioned her in every letter after," she said. "You did." He looked at Rosie, who had finished her soup and was looking at the cornbread, with an expression of such transparent longing that it was almost painful to witness. "Have another piece," he said to her, pushing the plate across. Rosie looked at Evelyn for permission. Evelyn nodded, and Rosie took the cornbread with the careful deliberateness of a child who has been taught that second helpings are not always guaranteed. Caleb watched this exchange without comment, and something shifted in his expression, some small tightening around the jaw, gone as quickly as it came. "The horse," he said to Evelyn. "I know," she said. She knew what it meant. She'd known since midday. "Pete will do what he can tonight. But I want to be honest with you, an animal in that condition, after that kind of cold." "I know," she said again more quietly. He studied her face. Whatever he found there, he didn't comment on it. "I need to talk to you about something," Evelyn said. She had practiced this on the road, had turned it over in her mind for the better part of 2 days, had decided there was no version of it that was anything other than what it was. "Before we discuss the arrangement, there's something you should know." She reached into her coat and took out the tax notice and set it on the table between them. Picked it up, read it, set it back down. $10, he said. "Due Friday," she said. 5 days from now. If it isn't paid, the land goes to auction. 40 acres. She looked at him directly, because she had decided if nothing else, she would look this man in the eye when she said the hard things. I didn't include this in my letter because I was afraid you wouldn't answer if you thought I was coming here only for the money. But I am telling you now because I won't start something on a lie, even a lie by omission. Looked at the notice again without picking it up. Then he looked at her. Is that why you answered the advertisement? Partly, she said. I also answered it because I have a 5-year-old daughter and an empty house, and I don't know how to give up on her. She paused. Probably not what you hoped to hear. I didn't hope to hear anything particular, he said. I asked what was true. She waited. He was quiet for a long time. Meh. Not the uncomfortable quiet of a man who doesn't know what to say, but the quiet of a man who is thinking something through fully before he opens his mouth. She had the impression he did this as a matter of habit, that there were very few things Caleb Rourke said that hadn't been thought about first. The horse, he said finally. What about him? You brought him to pay the tax. She hadn't said that. She hadn't said it because she'd hoped not to have to. She looked at the tax notice and Winter's approximate value and the simple arithmetic of the situation, and she said he's worth more than $10. I know that, but if you would accept him in exchange for covering the tax debt, I would be grateful. Worth at least $60, Caleb said. Maybe more if he was in better condition. Yes, she said, that's not a fair exchange. No, she agreed. Isn't, but it's what I have. He stood up. The movement was not abrupt or angry, but it had a finality to it, the motion of a man who has come to a decision and is done sitting down. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the barn, at the lamplight visible through the cracked boards, where she could only assume Pete the ranch hand was doing whatever could be done for Winter. I'm not taking your horse, he said. She felt something shift inside her, not relief, because it wasn't that simple, but something adjacent to it, and something adjacent to falling. Mr. Rourke, the tax will be paid, he said. That's not in question. He turned from the window. But I'm not buying your horse, and I'm not buying you. He looked at her steadily. What I'm offering is different from what you came out here expecting, and I want to say it plainly, so there's no confusion about what kind of arrangement this is. She waited. You and your daughter can stay here. There's room. The house is too large for one person, and I've never managed to make use of all of it. In exchange, I need someone to manage the house. Not cook, Dora does that. I mean manage, keep the accounts, oversee the supplies, handle the things I don't have time for because I'm outside most of the day. Your land stays yours. I'll pay the taxes alone if you want to call it that, or as nothing if you don't want that word attached to it. He paused. You keep your 40 acres. You keep your horse, if Pete can save him. And you're not my wife. You're your own person who lives in this house under an agreement. Evelyn stared at him. That's not a marriage, she said. No, he said, it isn't. You placed a matrimonial advertisement. I did, he said, without any apparent embarrassment. And I may have been unclear about what I actually needed. What I needed was someone who could run a household and manage the parts of this ranch I've been neglecting. What I put in the paper was apparently the wrong word for it. She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, exactly. Because there was something so genuinely peculiar about sitting in this cold, dusty ranch house having this conversation after 2 days of near-freezing travel with a sick horse and a hungry child, and she wasn't sure what else to do with the feeling. Why, she said. Why what? Why would you offer this? You don't know me. I came here with a sick horse and a tax bill and a child, and she stopped. That's a considerable amount of trouble to absorb for a stranger. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at Rosie, who had fallen asleep at the table with her cheek on her arm and a piece of cornbread still held loosely in one hand. Child's been asleep for 10 minutes, he said. She didn't make a sound, just closed her eyes and went. Something moved across his face, hard to name. Child that tired hasn't been comfortable in a long time. Picked up his hat from the peg by the door. The room at the end of the hall is yours, he said. There's a smaller one across from it for your daughter. Dora will show you. He opened the door. We'll talk about the rest in the morning. He went out. Evelyn sat at the table in the quiet kitchen, with the fire slowly pushing the cold back and Rosie sleeping 3 feet away. She looked at the tax notice, still sitting where she'd left it between them. She tried to understand what had just happened. She did not understand it, not entirely. But she thought of Thomas, who had been a decent man and not a brilliant one. And she thought, decent men still exist. She had not been completely certain of that. She was a little more certain now. She reached out and folded the tax notice carefully along its creases and put it back in her coat pocket. Then she gathered Rosie, who barely stirred, just turned her face against Evelyn's shoulder with the boneless trust of a deeply sleeping child, and carried her daughter down the hall toward the room at the end of it. Outside, she could hear the wind beginning to pick up against the eaves of the house. In the barn, the lamplight was still on. The lamplight in the barn was still burning when Evelyn woke before dawn. She lay in the unfamiliar bed for a moment, disoriented by the ceiling too high, too dark. Wrong shape before the events of the previous 2 days reassembled themselves in the correct order. Tax notice, the road, Winter stopping at the gate, kitchen table, and the man who sat across from it and said, plainly and without theater, "I'm not buying your horse. And I'm not buying you." She got up before Rosie stirred, dressed in the dark, and went to the barn. Pete was still there. He was a lean, weathered man somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of stillness that comes from years of sitting with animals in difficult situations. He was crouched near Winter's head when Evelyn came through the barn door, and he looked up at her without surprise, as if he had been expecting her and had simply not known when she'd arrive. "He made it through the night," Pete said before she could ask. "Ah." She crossed the barn floor and crouched beside Winter, who turned his head toward her and pressed his nose briefly against her hand. He was still breathing too carefully, each breath a considered thing, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been at the gate yesterday, and the trembling in his legs had stopped. "Is he going to be all right?" she asked. Pete tilted his head, which was not a yes but was not a no either. "Needs rest and warmth and feed. 2 weeks minimum before anything's asked of him. Maybe more." He paused. "He's a strong animal. Whatever he's got left in him, he's fighting to keep it." She put her hand on Winter's neck and felt the warmth of him, steady and real, and something she'd been holding tight in her chest since midday yesterday loosened by a fraction. "Thank you," she said, "for staying with him, Mr. Rourke asked me to," Pete said, which was true, but also, she suspected, not the whole truth. Nah. A man who stayed through the night with another person's animal out of nothing more than obligation would not look at that animal the way Pete was looking at Winter right now. She went back inside as the sky began to lighten. Dora Finch was already in the kitchen, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who has been starting fires and boiling water before the rest of the world wakes up for so long that it has become simply the shape of her mornings. She handed Evelyn a cup of coffee without comment, which Evelyn accepted with a gratitude she didn't have the words for yet. "Mr. Rourke eats at 6, Dora said. "The hands eat in the bunkhouse, not here." "You and the girl eat here." "Thank you," Evelyn said. Dora looked at her with the appraising eye of a woman who has seen many things come through a ranch house door and developed opinions about most of them. "Sleep?" Dora turned back to the stove. "Rosie, is it?" "The little one, yes. She's got her mother's eyes. Watching everything." A pause, not unfriendly. "She'll be fine here. Children adjust faster than people give them credit for, long as they feel safe." Evelyn wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Does she feel safe here?" "She ate 3 pieces of cornbread last night and fell asleep at the table," Dora said. "That's a child who stopped fighting long enough to rest. That's the beginning of safe." Caleb came in at 5 minutes to 6. He had already been outside. His boots were wet and he was carrying his gloves, which meant he'd been working for at least an hour before breakfast. He acknowledged Evelyn with a brief nod, poured his own coffee, sat at the head of the table in a way that suggested this was simply where he sat. It always sat, the way a man settles into the geography of his own life without thinking about it. Rosie appeared in the doorway about 3 minutes after Caleb sat down. She was still in her nightgown, her dark hair loose and unbraided, and she stopped when she saw him at the table. She looked at Evelyn, then back at Caleb, then at the bread Dora was slicing. "Good morning," Caleb said to her. Rosie considered him for a moment. "Morning," she said carefully. "Did you sleep?" "Yes." "Bed comfortable?" "A slight, very soft," she said, with a kind of careful diplomacy that clearly meant it's too soft, but I don't want to say so. Something moved at the corner of Caleb's mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "We'll get you a thinner mattress if you want." Rosie looked at him, surprised that he'd understood. "Okay," she said, and came the rest of the way into the kitchen and climbed onto the bench beside her mother. Evelyn watched this exchange and filed it away. The conversation at breakfast was sparse. Caleb ate quickly, the way a working man eats, not rudely, but with the efficiency of someone who treats the meal as fuel rather than occasion. He asked Evelyn 2 practical questions, whether she could work with household accounts and whether she had any experience managing supply orders. She answered yes to both, which was true. Thomas had handled their finances in theory, but in practice the task had fallen to Evelyn within the first year of their marriage, because she was better at it, and Thomas knew it and had been quietly relieved. "I'll show you the books after breakfast," Caleb said. "All right." He looked at his plate for a moment, then back at her. "Something I need to say plainly." She waited. "People in town are going to talk," he said, "about you being here. About the arrangement." He said the word without inflection, simply as a description. "It's a small valley. People talk about whatever is available to them, and a woman arriving from a matrimonial advertisement, and then not," he stopped, "chose another path. Terms of the arrangement are private. You don't owe anyone in Dunmore an explanation. But they'll make up whatever they like regardless." "I'm aware of how small towns work," she said. "Then you're prepared for it." "No," she said honestly. "But I've been warned, which is different." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the sense again of something being considered and then set aside. "Books are in the office," he said, and stood up. Ranch books were a disaster. Not fraudulently, nothing was missing or deliberately obscured. Were simply the records of a man who was excellent at running cattle and land and had no patience whatsoever for the paperwork that surrounded it. Entries were made in irregular bursts, sometimes weekly, sometimes with gaps of a month or more. Supply receipts were stuffed between pages without notation. Several columns didn't add up correctly, not because anyone had cheated, but because Caleb had simply carried a number wrong and then proceeded from the error without checking. Evelyn sat at the desk in the small office off the main hall and did not say any of this. She simply asked where the receipts were kept and began organizing them chronologically on the desk surface while Caleb stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her in a way that suggested he was trying to determine whether she actually knew what she was doing or was performing knowing. "After about 20 minutes, she said, without looking up, "We've been overcharged by the Dunmore Mercantile for the past 4 months. Pause. "How much?" "Somewhere between $11 and $14, depending on which delivery discrepancy I'm reading correctly." She held up 2 receipts side by side. "Freight charge is listed twice on this one. And this one," she tapped the second paper, "has a different unit price for the flour than the one you agreed to in September." "Price change?" He crossed the room and looked at the papers she was holding. He was close enough that she was aware of the particular smell of outdoor cold on his coat, the way it clings to wool and leather. He looked at the receipts for a long moment. "No," he said. "Didn't change." "Then someone's made an error. Possibly more than one." He straightened up. She could feel him recalibrating something, though she couldn't have said precisely what. "Can you fix it?" "I can organize it well enough that you'll be able to see exactly where the errors are and bring a clear case to Pratt's store. Whether Pratt corrects it is his business." She looked up at him. "Though in my experience, a man who can show you the specific receipt is harder to dismiss than a man who just says the numbers don't feel right." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "Pratt and I have history." "Kind of history?" "The kind where he's tried to buy my pasture land 3 times and I've said no 3 times. Then he definitely overcharged you deliberately." There was a brief silence. "Probably," Caleb said. She turned back to the receipts. "I'll have a summary ready by end of week." He stood there for another moment, and she had the sense he wanted to say something but hadn't decided on the form of it yet. She didn't look up to make it easier for him. Finally, he said the $10. She set down the receipt she was holding. "Yes, I'll ride to the county office tomorrow and settle the back tax. We'll issue a receipt in your name." He paused. "I'd like to do it before Friday to give the paperwork time to process." "That's yes. Thank you." The words felt inadequate, which was always the problem with gratitude for large things. There was no phrase that fit the actual weight of it. "It's a loan if you want it to be," he said. "Or nothing if you don't." "I'd like it to be a loan," she said. "I don't want anything I can't account for." Nodded once. "Fair enough." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "The horse. Pete thinks he'll recover. He told me this morning." "Good." He paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Winter's a remarkable animal. That distance, in that cold, carrying 2 people. Most horses would have gone down before the gate." "Stubborn," Evelyn said. "Thomas always said that was his best quality." Caleb looked at her, and the word Thomas sat in the air between them not awkwardly, but with the particular weight of names attached to people who are no longer present. "Must have been a good man," he said. "Not a question exactly." "Was," she said. "He wasn't exceptional at much. He was good, and that turned out to matter more than I understood when I was young enough to think those were different things." Caleb was quiet for a beat, Then I'll let you get to the books. Left. Evelyn sat in the office for a moment looking at nothing in particular. Then she picked up the next receipt and kept working. Town learned about her within the week. She should have expected it. Caleb had warned her, but the speed of it still caught her off guard. She rode into Dunmore with Caleb on Thursday to collect a supply order. She felt it the moment they turned onto the main street. The pause in conversation, the eyes that found her and stayed. The way two women standing outside the dressmaker's shop stopped talking simultaneously and watched the wagon pass with identical expressions of alert, hungry attention. She kept her face neutral and her spine straight and did not look directly at the women, which was the correct strategy but not a comfortable one. Pratt's Mercantile was the largest building on the main street, a double-fronted store with a covered porch, where men tended to gather in the afternoons. Caleb helped her down from the wagon without ceremony, and she was aware of every person on that porch watching the gesture its ordinariness, its lack of anything romantic and understanding that this would be reported and almost certainly misrepresented. Inside the store, Pratt himself came forward. He was a thick-chested man in his 40s, with a shopkeeper's practiced pleasantness, the kind that could be turned on and off with the efficiency of a lamp. He looked at Evelyn with undisguised appraisal before he looked at Caleb. "Rourke," he said, "I heard you had company arrive." "This is Mrs. Hart," Caleb said. "She'll be managing the household accounts. Supply orders will come from her going forward." Something moved behind Pratt's eyes, not quite surprise, not quite calculation, somewhere between the two. "Is that right?" It was not a question. He extended his hand to Evelyn with a smile that didn't quite reach any part of his face above his chin. "Welcome to Dunmore, Mrs. Hart." "Thank you," she said. Anne shook his hand and looked directly at him while she did it. She had the receipt discrepancy organized in her coat pocket, and she had debated whether to raise it today or wait. She waited. She wanted to understand the ground before she put weight on it. Collected the supply order, paid for it, and left. In the wagon on the way back, Caleb said, "You were quiet in there." "I was watching," she said. He glanced at her from the side. "And? He's not stupid," she said. "And he didn't like that I was introduced as the person handling accounts." "No," Caleb agreed. "He wouldn't." "I'll bring the receipt discrepancy to him next week," she said. "Not today. Let him think about what he's dealing with first." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Then that's a more patient approach than I would have taken." "I know," she said. "That's probably why I'm handling the accounts instead of you." There was a brief silence, and then she wasn't certain she heard it right, because it was quiet, and very quick a short sound that might have been a laugh. She didn't look at him. She looked at the road ahead. First real conflict came not from Pratt, but from a woman named Agnes Belmore, who was married to one of the other Valley ranchers, and who was, by several accounts Dora provided with careful neutrality, primary engine of social opinion in Larder Valley. Agnes appeared at the ranch on a Friday afternoon, unannounced, with a neighbor woman named Cecilia Marsh, and asked for Evelyn by name. Dora showed them to the front room, which Evelyn had spent the past week cleaning and reordering, and Evelyn came in from the office to find two women sitting with the particular composed posture of people who have come somewhere with an agenda. "Mrs. Hart," Agnes said, looking around the room with the air of someone cataloging changes. "We wanted to come welcome you to the Valley." She had a pleasant face and a voice trained to warmth, and Evelyn recognized instantly, with the tiredness of experience, exactly what kind of welcome this was. "It's very kind," Evelyn said and sat. Agnes's eyes moved over Evelyn's dress, clean but plain, the same one she'd worn since arriving, and then to the desk visible through the open office door, where the ranch accounts were spread out, and then back to Evelyn's face with an expression of bright, studied sympathy. "It must have been a difficult journey," Agnes said. "Coming so far, and with a young child." A pause. "We were surprised, I'll be honest, when we heard the arrangement. We understood Mr. Rourke's advertisement to be, well, a matrimonial one." "It was," Evelyn said. Agnes blinked. Cecilia glanced sideways. "Situation changed," Evelyn said when Mr. Rourke and I spoke. "We came to an arrangement that suited both of us better than the original terms." "I see." Agnes's voice remained pleasant, but her eyes were doing something else entirely. "And the little girl she settled in?" "Very well, thank you." "It must be a relief," Agnes said, with a specific kind of softness that had teeth in it, "to have found such a comfortable situation. After, well, we heard about your circumstances." The room went a degree or two cooler. "Then you heard that my husband died and left us with very little," Evelyn said. "True. And you heard that I came west to find a solution, which is also true. I'm not sure what about that requires relief on my behalf, but I appreciate the concern. Agnes opened her mouth and then closed it. Cecilia looked at the floor. I'm happy to tell anyone who asks. Evelyn continued, with a voice that was perfectly steady. That Mr. Rourke has been fair and decent, that he's offered us a reasonable arrangement, and that I'm working for what we have here. Valley has a different story they'd prefer to tell. I can't stop them. But I'd rather they heard the plain one from me first. There was a silence that lasted several seconds, which was not comfortable for anyone in the room, including Evelyn. Agnes recovered first. Well, she said, adjusting her gloves. I suppose that's very straightforward. I found it saves time, Evelyn said. Left about 15 minutes later, with the careful cordiality of two women who have come to understand that the territory they expected to find is occupied and defended. Evelyn sat in the front room alone for a moment after they went. Ran her hands, hidden in her lap during the conversation, shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the particular strain of keeping your voice level and your face composed when everything in you wants to do something else. She pressed them flat on her knees and breathed. From the hallway, a small voice said, "They weren't very nice." Turned. Rosie was standing at the corner of the hallway, half behind the wall, with the look of a child who knows she wasn't supposed to be listening and is hoping this will not be held against her. No, Evelyn said. They weren't. But sometimes people who aren't very nice need to be shown that you know what they're doing, and then they mostly stop. Rosie thought about this seriously. Did it work? We'll see, Evelyn said. Come here. Rosie came and climbed onto the settee beside her, and Evelyn put her arm around her daughter, and they sat for a moment in the quiet room while outside the wind pushed through the valley grass in long, rolling sweeps. Caleb found out about Agnes Belmore's visit from Dora, not from Evelyn. Gah. He came to the office that evening while Evelyn was finishing the supply summary and stood in the doorway, and she looked up and knew from the set of his shoulders that he knew. Could have told me, he said. There was nothing you needed to do about it, she said. Could have what? She said, not unkindly. Told Agnes Belmore to mind her business. That would help me considerably less than handling it myself, and it would take away the only thing I actually have in this valley, which is people understanding that I'm not someone who needs rescuing from conversations. Gah, he looked at her for a moment. He did that often held a look for slightly longer than was strictly necessary, as if he was reading something in her face that she was unaware of writing. Dora said you were direct with her, he said I was. Agnes Belmore doesn't handle direct particularly well. She'll manage, Evelyn said, and looked back at her papers. He came into the room then, which he didn't often do. Usually he stood in the doorway as if he hadn't fully decided whether the office was a place he was allowed to be now. He looked at the organized rows of receipts, the ledger with its columns corrected and cross-referenced, the summary sheet she was working on. You've been at this all day, he said. Most of it. I don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. I want it done correctly. The discrepancy with Pratt is larger than I initially estimated. It's closer to $16 over the 4 months. Pause. $16. He's been systematically adding small overcharges. Not large enough to be obvious item by item, but consistent. Same items, every order, just slightly over. She looked up. It's not a mistake. The expression on Caleb's face was not one she'd seen before, a specific flatness that she suspected was what his anger looked like when he was keeping it contained. How long has this been going on? The books only go back 2 years in detail. Been longer. She spread her hands. I can only tell you what's documented. Looked at the ledger. That's significant money. She said, it is. She paused. I want to be careful about how we bring it to him. If we accuse him of deliberate fraud, he'll get defensive, and the valley will take sides, and it becomes an argument about character. If I bring him a clearly documented accounting error and give him the opportunity to correct it himself, he looks like a man who made a mistake, and you get your money back without a war. Caleb looked at her. That's what you were thinking about in the store Thursday. Partly. He pulled the chair from the corner of the room and sat down, which surprised her. He'd never sat in the office before, only stood. Gah, he looked at the papers on the desk, and she had the sense he was seeing not just the numbers, but something larger that the numbers represented. I've never trusted him, he said. But I also never looked closely enough to prove it. You were busy running cattle, she said. It's hard to look at ledgers when you're outside all day. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. She picked up her pen. I'll have the summary finished tomorrow. We'll go in Monday, I think. Give him the weekend with no warning. He was quiet for a moment. "You're good at this," he said, and it came out like something he'd been deciding whether to say out loud. She looked at him. At accounting? At thinking 3 steps ahead. She considered that for a second. "Thomas used to say I thought like a man. He meant it as a compliment. I never quite took it as one." "It's not a compliment or an insult," Caleb said. "It's just an observation. Not everyone thinks that way." She looked back at her work. "It's what happens when you don't have the option of getting it wrong." That sat in the air between them for a moment, not uncomfortably, but with the particular weight of a true thing that has been said simply enough to land. Stood up. "I'll let you finish. Thank you for the coffee earlier," she said. "I didn't say so at the time." He had left a cup of coffee outside the office door at some point in the afternoon. She hadn't seen him leave it. He said nothing for a moment. "It was just coffee," he said. "I know what it was," she said. He left. She sat looking at the office door for a moment after it closed, and then she dipped her pen and went back to the numbers. The following Monday, she rode into Dunmore with Caleb and confronted Orville Pratt. She had the summary in a leather folder 6 pages, documented by date, cross-reference to specific receipts. Total discrepancy noted at the bottom in large, clear numerals. $16.43 over 19 months. She set it on the counter in front of Pratt, while 2 other customers browsed the back of the store, pretending not to watch, and she explained what it contained in a voice that was pleasant and entirely without heat. Pratt looked at the summary. Looked at her. Looked at Caleb, who was standing near the door with his arms at his sides and his face doing the particular flat, contained thing she'd seen the other night. "There seems to be some confusion," Pratt began. "I don't think there is," Evelyn said, "but I'm happy to walk through each item, if that would help." There was a silence that stretched, in ways that silences do, when everyone in the room knows exactly what the situation is, and one person is deciding whether to concede or escalate. Pratt was not a stupid man, she reminded herself. He'd been watching Caleb's operation for years, finding small ways to take pieces of it. He understood that the person across the counter from him now had just changed the equation. "I'll need to review my records," he said finally. "Of course," she said. "I've left a copy of the summary with you. I've kept the originals." She closed the leather folder and picked it up off the counter. "We'll look forward to your review." She walked to the door. Caleb held it for her. Neither of them said anything until they were back in the wagon and moving down the main street. "He's going to be unpleasant about this," Caleb said. "Probably," she said. "He has friends in town, I know." She looked at the road. "Now he also knows that I know, and that what I know is documented. That's a different kind of problem for him than you driving in here angry and making accusations." Caleb drove in silence for a moment. "Then when did you get so comfortable in hostile rooms?" She thought about that honestly. "My husband was sick for 2 years before he died," she said. "We had a neighbor, a man named Grafton, who kept offering to buy our 40 acres for less than it was worth. Come by when Thomas was bad, when I hadn't slept and the money was gone, and he'd sit in our kitchen and make offers with this smile that was very similar to Pratt's." She paused. Got comfortable saying no clearly. After that, hostile rooms just seemed like a variation. Caleb said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had something in it she didn't hear there often. "Grafton ever push harder than that?" "He tried once," she said. Once was enough. She did not elaborate. He did not ask. She felt him register it, a small, particular shift in the air beside her, on the wagon bench, something that moved through him and settled. They rode back to the ranch in the late morning light. The valley spread wide around them, the mountains still white along the tops, and the road between them and home clear and frozen solid beneath the wheels. The letter from the county office arrived on a Wednesday, 10 days after their trip to Dunmore. Evelyn was in the kitchen with Rosie when Caleb brought it in from the post. Set it on the table in front of her without comment. She looked at the return address, the county land office, and opened it carefully. Back taxes on 40 acres registered to Evelyn M. Hart and Cody County had been paid and receipted. The land was no longer subject to auction proceedings. Receipt was issued in her name. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and set it on the table. Rosie looked up from the picture she was drawing. "What is it, Mama?" "Good news," Evelyn said. Rosie looked at the letter, then at her mother's face. Not smiling, she observed. "I will," Evelyn said. "In a minute." She looked at Caleb, who was standing by the kitchen door with his hat in his hands. She understood that the thing she felt was not relief, or not only relief, but the particular disorientation of someone who has been braced for a long time and is suddenly without the thing they were bracing against. 40 acres were safe. They were hers. They would not be taken. She pressed her lips together and breathed. "Thank you," she said to Caleb. "I know I've said it. I'm saying it again because it deserves to be said more than once." Nodded once. "You're building me a decent set of accounts," he said. "It's a fair trade. It's not close to a fair trade and we both know it," she said. Said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. That evening, after Rosie was in bed, Evelyn sat at the desk in the office and wrote 2 letters. First was to the county land office, acknowledging receipt of the tax payment confirmation and requesting a copy be sent to her home address in Cody County, as well her 40 acres. Her address, hers. Second was to no one in particular. She began it, and then stopped after 2 sentences and folded it and put it in the stove. Because some things don't become clearer by writing them down. They just become more real. She wasn't ready for all of it to be real yet. She sat in the quiet office with the lamp turned low, listening to the house settle around her in the cold. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once and was answered by silence. She thought about Thomas, the way she often did in quiet moments, not with grief exactly, or not only grief, but with the particular ache of someone who is beginning, slowly and against their own resistance, to understand that moving forward does not mean leaving behind. That a woman could carry one life in her hands and walk toward another without the first one spilling. She wasn't sure she believed that yet, but she was beginning to believe it might be possible. She turned the lamp down further and went to bed. In the barn, Winter was eating steadily, his breathing even, his legs still. Pete had left a fresh blanket over his back. The white horse stood in the warm dark and did not shiver. Pratt paid the $16.43 back on a Thursday, delivered by way of a ranch hand. Evelyn didn't recognize who knocked on the front door and handed her an envelope without a word or a letter inside it. Just the money, counted out exactly, in a combination of bills and coin that suggested it had been assembled from whatever was available and not thought about too carefully. She counted it twice at the kitchen table, confirmed the amount, and put it in the ranch accounts under recovered overcharged Dunmore Mercantile with the date written beside it in her clearest hand. She said nothing to Caleb about the satisfaction she felt doing that. But she felt it. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. She had lived for most of the past 2 years in a state of low-grade emergency, the kind where you don't plan further than the next problem, because the next problem is always visible from where you're standing. There had been no room in that life for anything as ordinary as routine. Yet here, in Caleb Rourke's neglected ranch house, routine was assembling itself around her like a structure she hadn't built, but found herself inside anyway. Mornings, coffee before dawn, accounts, Rosie at breakfast. Afternoons, supply management, correspondence with vendors in Cheyenne and Casper that Caleb had been ignoring for months. Slow work of organizing a household that had been running on Dora Finch's sheer competence alone for years, without anyone to share the administrative weight. Evenings, sometimes quiet, sometimes a brief exchange with Caleb at the kitchen table over whatever was left from supper. Talking about the ranch in the practical shorthand of 2 people who have found they can communicate efficiently without much ornament. It was not a marriage. She reminded herself of this with some regularity, though with decreasing frequency as the weeks passed, which she noticed and did not entirely know what to do with. The thing she had not anticipated was Caleb himself. She had arrived expecting a certain kind of man, wealthy, gut solitary, set in his ways to the point of rigidity, kind of person who places a matrimonial advertisement, because the alternative is admitting loneliness in a more direct way. He was some of those things. He was solitary in the bone-deep way of a man who has lived alone long enough that the silence has become a habit his body carries even in company. Set in his ways, she had learned quickly that there were things Caleb Rourke did at specific times for specific reasons that were not negotiable. Not because he was inflexible, but because the ranch demanded a kind of consistency that had long since merged with his own character until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. But he was not what she'd expected in the ways that mattered. He noticed things, but not in the obvious, demonstrative way of a man trying to impress. He didn't comment on her work, didn't praise her management of the accounts or the order she'd brought to the supply system, at least not in those words. But she would come to the office in the morning to find the fire already built up against the cold, which it hadn't been the first week. She found, one afternoon, Yet the window latch in her room that had been sticking since she arrived had been fixed. Mechanism oiled and moving cleanly, with no mention of it from anyone. Chair in the office, an uncomfortable, straight-backed thing, had been replaced, without comment, by the padded one from the front room. She noticed these things the way you notice a change in weather, not by looking directly at it, but by the way the air around you feels different. Rosie noticed him too, in the particular way of children who have not yet learned to be politic about their observations. She reported to Evelyn one evening, with the gravity of important news, that Mr. Rourke had fixed the latch on the barn door so it didn't pinch your fingers when you opened it. Gah, she reported. Another time, that he had shown her how to read the sky for snow, a specific configuration of cloud and wind direction that, according to him, was more reliable than any almanac. Rosie repeated this information with the serious confidence of a person who has been trusted with expert knowledge. Said the almanac is usually wrong, Rosie told Evelyn at supper one evening. Did he? He said the cattle know before the almanac does. A pause. Said you can tell by how they bunch. That sounds about right, Evelyn said. I looked at the cattle this morning, Rosie said. They weren't bunching. Then no snow today, Rosie considered this. Ah, he talks to me like I'm a person, she said, which was the kind of statement that only makes sense from a child who has encountered the alternative often enough to know the difference. Evelyn looked at her daughter for a moment. Yes, she said. He does. She thought about that longer than she meant to, after Rosie was in bed. Trouble from town arrived in a different form than she'd expected. She had been prepared for gossip, Caleb had warned her. Agnes Belmore had demonstrated the shape of it on that first visit. Dora had provided, in her careful, neutral way, a running account of what was being said in Dunmore without editorializing. Gossip itself was predictable. That Evelyn Hart had come west with a manufactured story and an eye for a wealthy ranch. The child was a prop for sympathy. That Caleb Rourke was a decent man being managed by a woman, smart enough to make it look like an arrangement when what it really was a trap. She had expected this and was not destroyed by it. She had thicker skin than she'd had 2 years ago, and the 40 acres were safe. Rosie was eating 3 meals a day and sleeping in a warm room, and the specific weight of genuine poverty had lifted enough from her shoulders that she had room now to absorb social hostility without it knocking her down. What she had not prepared for was the afternoon 3 men from the valley rode onto the property. She was outside with Rosie a rare mild afternoon, pale winter sun strong enough to take the edge off the cold when she heard the horses coming up the track. 3 riders, none of them ranch hands she recognized. Ah! She put her hand on Rosie's shoulder without thinking, the instinctive gesture of a woman who has learned to position herself between her child and uncertainty. Lead rider was a man named Del Harker, who owned a mid-sized spread north of Dunmore. She recognized him from a trip into town, a florid, loud man, the kind who fills rooms not with intelligence, but with volume. He pulled up near the fence line and looked down at her from his horse with the particular expression of a man who has come somewhere with an audience in mind. Mrs. Hart, he said. We heard Rourke wasn't home. He's on the south pasture, she said. If you have business with him, you're welcome to wait. Harker looked at the other 2 riders, a younger man she didn't know, and Pratt's assistant from the mercantile, a thin-faced person named Lowell, with the briefest of glances that was also a performance. Came to talk to you, actually. She kept her hand on Rosie's shoulder, and her face neutral. What about? There's been some talk, Harker said, settling back in his saddle, about the situation here. People in the valley are concerned. Are they, she said. Rourke's a well-regarded man. He's done right by this valley for years. People don't like seeing a man, a decent man, taken advantage of by a... He paused, choosing his word with the deliberateness of someone who wants to say the thing without quite saying it. By a stranger. The cold came up through her boots, and she felt it in her back teeth. I see, she said. Now, I'm not saying anything improper, Harker said in the tone of a man saying something improper. I'm just saying the valley has eyes, and what people see is a woman who came here under a certain premise and then set herself up real comfortable without the original arrangement actually being made. Rosie had gone completely still beside her. Evelyn could feel it. The arrangement that was made, Evelyn said, is between Mr. Rourke and myself, and it's none of the valley's business. When a good man is being taken, I heard you the first time, she said, and her voice was steady in the way that a rope is steady when it's pulled taut, not calm, but controlled. I'll tell you what I told Mrs. Belmore when she came here with a similar concern. I work for what I have in this house. I manage the household accounts. I've recovered money from your friend Pratt's deliberate overcharging. I keep the records that Mr. Rourke didn't have time to keep himself, and I have not asked for anything I wasn't offered first. That troubles the Valley. The Valley can direct its concern elsewhere. Harker's face had gone a color that suggested she'd moved faster than he'd anticipated. He'd expected. She thought. Either tears or apologies. Again, she had given him neither. Girl, he said, with a change of tack that told her he was regrouping. Bringing a child into the situation, the child, Evelyn said, is my daughter. She is not part of this conversation. Rosie pressed slightly closer against her side. Evelyn did not look down, would not look down, because looking down would be showing something she was not willing to show to these men. I think you should leave, she said. Mr. Rourke will be back within the hour if you have legitimate business with him. If you came here to make a point to me, you've made it, and I haven't changed my mind, so there's nothing more to accomplish. Harker looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Lowell, then the younger man, and she could see in his expression the particular frustration of a person who prepared for a fight and found the other party was not playing the right role. Touched his hat brim, a gesture that was technically polite and was nothing of the kind, and turned his horse. Rode back down the track. She watched them go. Then she looked down at Rosie. Rosie was looking up at her with wide, dark eyes, and her lower lip was doing the thing it did when she was working very hard not to cry. Rose, bad men? She asked quietly. Evelyn crouched down to her daughter's level. Rosie's face was cold pink from the air, and her breath came in small, visible puffs. Small men, Evelyn said, which was different from bad and also more true. Small men make a lot of noise when they think no one will argue back. Argued back, Rosie said. I did. Were you scared? Evelyn looked at her daughter's face and considered the question with the honesty it deserved. My hands were shaking, she said. But I knew what I was going to say, so I said it. Rosie absorbed this. Okay, she said. Dawn leaned her forehead briefly against Evelyn's shoulder, which was the closest Rosie ever came to asking to be held without actually asking. Evelyn put her arms around her daughter and held on for a moment in the pale afternoon light. She did not tell Caleb about Harker's visit. She made this decision deliberately and without agonizing over it. Telling him would accomplish one of two things. Either he would ride to Harker's property and escalate the conflict in a way that would benefit no one, or he would feel guilty about her being in this position because of his advertisement, and guilt made people do unpredictable things. Neither outcome served her. She was managing it. She would continue managing it. What she hadn't counted on was Dora. Dora Finch had a network of information in the Larder Valley that would have been impressive in a much larger city. She heard things the way water finds level without apparent effort, through the path of least resistance, gathering as it moved. She knew who had ridden where and when, before most people knew their own business had been noticed. She told Caleb about Harker's visit the following morning at breakfast. Evelyn knew the moment he walked into the kitchen. He had a particular quality of stillness when he was containing something, a compression around the jaw, a careful way of setting things down. Poured his coffee and sat, and she looked at him and knew. I was going to handle it, she said before he could speak. At her. Harker came on this property. He did. Spoke to you and Rosie. He spoke to me. Rosie was present. She set down her cup. Sent him away. It's handled. It's not. He stopped. Started again at a lower register. He had no right to come here. No, she agreed. He didn't. But men like Harker operate on what they can get away with, and what he got away with was a conversation that ended with him leaving. That's the result I wanted. That's not. He was struggling with something. She could see it. A man whose instinct was toward direct action, being asked to accept that the action already taken was the right kind. Should have told me. And you would have done what? She said, not unkindly. He didn't answer that, which was its own answer. I appreciate that it bothers you, she said. I'd rather it not happen again. But I need you to understand that the way I handle these things is not the same as you handling them, and that's not a failure of one approach or the other. It's just different. She paused. Your name on this valley carries weight. My name carries very little right now. If you ride to Harker's spread angry, it becomes a dispute between two ranchers and I'm the cause of it. If I send him away myself, it becomes a conversation that didn't go his way and might not be worth repeating. Sat with that for a moment. I don't like it, he said. I know, she said. I didn't like it either. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Rosie came in from the hallway in her boots and coat, ready to go out, and looked at both of them with the evaluating eye of a child who understands that something has been discussed even when she doesn't know what. "Is everything all right?" Rosie asked. "Yes," Evelyn said. Rosie looked at Caleb. "Fine," he said, which was not the same word but served the same purpose. Rosie appeared to accept this at face value, which was either genuine or diplomatic, and Evelyn had not yet determined which her daughter was more capable of. The march came in sideways, the way it often did in Wyoming, not with any warmth but with a shift in the quality of cold, something that suggested spring existed theoretically even if it remained personally unavailable. Snow on the south-facing slopes softened during the day and refroze at night into a crust that made travel difficult. Cattle moved differently in this in-between season, restless and hard to read. Caleb was out earlier and later as March progressed. She would hear him come in past dark, hear his boots in the hall, hear the particular sound of a man trying not to make sound in a house where other people are sleeping, careful, methodical, almost touching in its consideration. One night she was still up when he came in, sitting at the office desk with the lamp turned low, working through a vendor contract she'd been revising. She heard the front door, heard him stop, saw the thin line of lamplight under the office door change when he paused in the hall. "Knock." "Still up?" he said through the door. "Yes." "Come in if you want." He came in. He was cold through, she could feel it, from 3 feet away, and he had the particular windburned look of a man who'd been outside in hard conditions for too many hours. Sat in the padded chair, the one that had come from the front room, and stretched his legs out with the slow care of someone whose body is registering complaint. "North fence," he said. "Bad?" "Bad enough. We lost 2 sections in the freeze. Found it today." He rubbed his face with both hands. "You have to pull men off the pasture rotation to fix it, which means the east pasture doesn't get checked, and I've had a suspicion about the drainage there since February." She turned from the desk to face him. "How long to fix the fence?" 2 days if the weather holds. 3 if it doesn't. "Can you check the east pasture drainage first? Just a quick look, before you commit everyone to the fence line." He looked at her. "In this thaw-freeze cycle, the fence has been broken for at least a day already, possibly more," she said. "Another few hours won't make the difference. But if the drainage issue in the east pasture is what I think it might be if it's related to the blockage in the creek runoff that's noted in your spring records from 2 years ago, then missing it now could mean flooding the lower pasture when real thaw comes and losing that grazing land for the season." He was quiet. "I read the spring record," she said, a little unnecessarily. "I see that," he said. "The notation from 2 years ago is in your handwriting, but it's short. I wasn't sure what you found." "Found a partial dam in the creek," he said slowly. "Debris. We cleared it, but it wasn't a full clearing. We were rushed." "Then it's probably built back up," she said. 2 years of debris accumulation in a partial blockage. She turned back to the desk and pulled out the ranch map, a large hand-drawn document that she'd found folded in the back of the supply cabinet and had spent a full afternoon studying. She pointed to the east pasture marker. "Here?" "Ah." He got up, came to look over her shoulder at the map. And she was aware of his proximity, the height of him. Cold still coming off his coat, the way he leaned in slightly to see the detail of the map without touching her. "Creek comes off the ridge here," he said, putting his finger on the map. "Feeds the lower pasture through this channel. If the partial dam has built up again, the lower pasture floods before the ground is thawed enough to drain it," she said. "Yes," he said. "Which means that section is useless for early spring grazing." He straightened up. He was close enough that she could have turned her head, and they'd have been speaking at a different kind of distance. But she did not turn her head, and he stepped back to a reasonable remove without making it a thing. "You've been reading the ranch records." "I've been managing the household accounts for 2 months, she said. "Accounts don't make sense without the operational context. Most people who do the accounts don't read the operational records. Most people who do the accounts don't have a stake in the operation," she said. Looked at her. "You have a stake." "I live here," she said. "My daughter lives here. What happens to this ranch matters to me." She paused, aware that she'd said more than she'd meant to, or more directly than she'd intended. She turned back to the map and straightened it. "I'd check the east pasture first," she said. "Even an hour, just to see." He stood for a moment longer than the conversation required. "All right," he said. He left. She sat at the desk in the quiet office and told herself, firmly and with some conviction, that she was thinking about the ranch accounts. Checked the east pasture the following morning and found what she'd suspected. Partial dam had rebuilt substantially over 2 winters, and the blockage was serious enough that a proper thaw would have sent water across the lower pasture in volume. Set one man to the clearing work immediately and redirected the others to the fence. When, by the end of the week, both problems were addressed, though neither cleanly, the fence repair had to wait for a replacement post-delivery. On the creek clearing was harder than expected and took 3 men most of a day. He reported this to her at supper on Friday with the direct brevity of a man filing a report, and she listened and made a note in the ranch log, and that was that. Except that it wasn't entirely. Because over the next 2 weeks, something shifted in the way Caleb talked to her about the ranch. Not dramatically, he was not a dramatic man, and she was not a woman who trusted dramatic shifts. Conversation that had previously moved in one direction, her asking questions, him answering with varying degrees of detail, began to move differently. He started bringing things to her. Not formally, not sitting down and saying, "I need your input," but in the casual, sideways way of a man who has started thinking of another person as part of his process without quite meaning to. He would come in from the south pasture and mention, almost incidentally, that he was thinking about moving the yearlings early this year, and then he would pause in a way that was clearly waiting for her response. And she would think about it and respond, and he would take what she said seriously without making a ceremony of it. She was not sure exactly when this had started. She was not sure it mattered. What mattered, she told herself, was the ranch. The practical reality of 2 people who had found they could think productively together. That was useful. That was the arrangement. She repeated this to herself with reasonable conviction. The storm arrived in the 3rd week of March without adequate warning. This was the thing that people who had never lived in Wyoming didn't understand. The warnings were almost always there, if you knew how to read them. Sky, the cattle, the particular pressure in the air. This storm came in on a dry, cold wind that shifted direction twice in the space of an hour. And by the time the temperature dropped fast enough to signal real danger, Cloudbank was already over the mountains and moving with a speed that left almost no time. Caleb saw it from the south pasture and rode back hard. She heard him come in the urgency in his horse's hooves on the frozen ground, the door thrown open, and she came out of the office to find him already talking to the 2 hands who'd been in the bunkhouse. Get the cattle in from the south and east fields, he said. Leave the north, there's not time. Move fast. He turned to her. Stay inside with Rosie. Don't come out for any reason. What about the cattle in the north pasture? She asked. I'll bring them in myself. There's a windbreak on the north fence line. They may shelter there on their own. I need to— How many? 11 head. And the hands are on the south and east. Yes. He was pulling on his heaviest coat, moving fast. I'll take Pete. She looked at the sky through the kitchen window. It had gone the particular color of a serious storm, not the dramatic gray-black of summer lightning, but a flat, muffled white that was in some ways worse, because it meant the cold was coming with the snow, not after it. How long do you have? She said. Less than I want, he said, and went. She watched from the window as he and Pete rode north. The first snow came within 20 minutes light, testing, the kind that was just the introduction. Rosie came to stand beside her. Where's he going? Rosie asked. North pasture. There are cattle. Rosie looked at the sky with the expression she'd been developing since Caleb showed her how to read it. That's bad snow, she said. Yes, Evelyn said, it is. She stood at the window and told herself he knew this land better than anyone, that Pete had been working this ranch for 11 years, that they would move fast and be back before the worst of it. She told herself this in the methodical way you apply logic to a feeling that is not particularly interested in being logical. Snow thickened. The light went gray and then grayer. An hour passed. The hands came back with the south and east cattle. She could hear the movement, the sound of animals being driven into the barn at speed. She counted heads through the window as best she could and confirmed they were all in. North pasture remained silent. An hour and 15 minutes. Dora came to stand beside her without speaking. The 2 women looked at the snow, which was now heavy enough that the barn was a shape rather than a structure, its edges dissolved into the white. Knows this land, Dora said. I know, Evelyn said. An hour and 30 minutes. She turned from the window. Dora, she said, where are the extra blankets kept? Dora looked at her. Hall cupboard. Top shelf. And the rope? Pause. Barn, I need you to stay with Rosie, Evelyn said. Evelyn, I need you to stay with Rosie, she said again, and she was already moving toward the coat hooks by the door. Rosie had turned from the window. She was looking at her mother with wide, dark eyes, and the particular stillness of a child who understands that a decision has been made and protests will not change it. "I'll be back," Evelyn said, and crouched down briefly to Rosie's level. "Stay with Dora. You stay inside. Take the rope," Rosie said quietly, "so you don't get lost." She nearly didn't make it. Got the rope from the barn first 60 feet of it, coiled on a post near the door, and tied one end to the barn door handle. She moved into the white. The storm was not playing. Wind had found its register, and it was the serious kind, the kind that takes your direction and your sense and your certainty about which way is which and dissolves them in the time it takes to draw a breath. Kept the rope in her left hand and moved forward. Rope paid out behind her. When it ran to its end, she would know she'd gone 60 feet from the barn, and the north pasture fence line was roughly 80 feet beyond that. 60 feet of rope, plus her own measure. The cattle found her before she found them. She heard them first, the dense, close sound of animals pressed together for warmth, and then she felt the mass of them in the white, a wall of heat and breath, and the particular smell of frightened cattle. She shifted when she appeared among them. Restless and unhappy, she moved through them with her hands out, talking low and steady, the way she'd learned you had to with a spooked animal. She found Caleb by his horse. The horse was standing still with its head down, and Caleb was on the ground beside it. Not unconscious, he turned when she reached him, but clearly fighting to stay that way. He had gone down in the snow, and his left leg was at an angle she didn't like, and the cold had gotten into him. She could see it in the gray of his face and the way he was moving. Not moving. Trying to move and not quite managing it. "Rope," she said loudly, over the wind. "I have a rope to the barn." He looked at her with the specific confusion of a person whose body is shutting down options. "Can you stand?" He tried. Got halfway up, and his leg gave, and she caught him or tried to. He was considerably larger than her, and it was not graceful. Not even close to graceful. But she got her shoulder under his arm, and her feet braced, and she held. "The leg," she said. "I twisted it going down. It's not broken." He said this with the conviction of a man who wants very much for it to be true. "I can walk, then walk," she said. He walked. Badly, unevenly, with her bearing more of his weight than either of them had expected. Rope in her free hand paid back toward the barn as they moved. The cattle followed them, because cattle in a storm will follow any moving thing that isn't the storm, and she let them, because having them moving was better than having them standing still in the white. 50 feet of rope, then her own measure. Then the barn wall appeared in the white, and she nearly went into it face first and didn't care at all. She got Caleb inside, got the cattle inside after them. Left the rope tied to the door handle in case anyone needed it again, and turned to Caleb, who had sat down on a hay bale and was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "Came out in that," he said. She was catching her breath. "Didn't come back?" she said. "I fell. The horse shied on a patch of ice and I went down, and the cattle, they scattered a little, and by the time I got them gathered, the leg was—" He stopped. "Shouldn't have come out in that." "I used a rope," she said. "I wasn't completely reckless." He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and the barn was warm and close around them, with the animals pressing in from the cold, and the storm roaring against the boards with the single-minded fury of something that doesn't care what it destroys. "I'm going to get Pete," she said, "and Dora, and we're going to look at your leg properly." "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. He looked at her with that expression still on his face, the one she hadn't seen before, the one she didn't have a name for yet. His face was wind-raw, and his leg was wrong, and he'd been on the ground in a Wyoming blizzard for nearly 2 hours, and he looked at her like she was something he hadn't understood until this exact moment. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple thing to say. It was not a simple thing the way he said it. "Come on," she said more quietly than she meant to. "Let's get you inside." "Nah." She helped him up, her shoulder under his arm again, and they moved through the barn toward the door that led to the ranch house, and outside the storm, hammered and shrieked against every surface it could find. And inside the barn, the cattle shifted and breathed, and the warmth held. She could feel Rosie, watching from the kitchen window as they came through the snow toward the house, a small, dark-eyed shape pressed against the glass, watching her mother come back out of the white with the man she'd gone looking for. Evelyn kept her eyes on the door and kept walking. Inside, the fire was burning. Dora already had water heating. Rosie ran to Evelyn and pressed her face against her coat without saying anything, and Evelyn held her daughter for a moment with one hand while keeping her other arm around Caleb because he was not quite steady enough to trust on his own yet. "I knew you'd find him," Rosie said against her coat. Didn't know that, Evelyn said. I did, Rosie said. You always come back. Evelyn held her daughter and looked across the room at Dora, who was looking back at her with an expression that was not quite unreadable. And the storm outside made its noise against the house. And inside, everything held. The leg was not broken. This was the first thing Pete confirmed, kneeling on the kitchen floor beside Caleb's chair with the no-ceremony practicality of a man who has assessed injuries in worse conditions than a warm kitchen. Pressed along the bone with careful fingers while Caleb sat with his jaw set and said nothing, and Pete said, not broken. Bad sprain, maybe a torn something in there. He needs to stay off it. For how long, Caleb said. Not a question exactly. Week minimum, Pete said. 2 if you want it to heal right. I don't have 2 weeks. No, Pete agreed. You never do. He stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at Evelyn. Keep it elevated tonight. The swelling needs to come down before he puts weight on it. He looked back at Kate Caleb with the expression of a man who knows his advice will be partially followed at best. I mean it about the weight. I heard you, Caleb said. Pete left to check the cattle. Dora brought a basin of cold water and a cloth and set it on the floor without comment. Caleb looked at it and then at Evelyn with an expression that was not quite reluctance and not quite pride, but was somewhere in that difficult territory between them. I can manage, he said. I know you can, she said. He pulled a chair to face his and sat, began unwrapping his boot with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who has decided the argument is already over. Gah, he let her. Boot came off with more difficulty than either of them showed on their faces. She set it aside and looked at the ankle, which was already swelling in the particular, determined way of a joint that has been badly insulted. Rosie watched from the hallway doorway. She had been watching since they came inside, positioned at the edge of the room with the quiet attentiveness of a child, who has learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is stay out of the way and pay attention. Does it hurt a lot? Rosie asked. Caleb looked at her. Some, he said. My mama says it's all right to say when something hurts, Rosie said. She says pretending it doesn't makes it worse. There was a brief silence. Your mama's right, Caleb said, which was not something he'd said without qualification before. Rosie appeared to recognize this, because she nodded with the gravity of a small person filing away important information. Evelyn pressed the cold cloth to his ankle and did not look up. Storm ran itself out sometime in the early hours of the morning, the way bad storms do not gracefully, but with a kind of exhausted diminishment, wind dropping in stages and the snow thinning from heavy to light to a fine, drifting nothing. By dawn the sky was the washed pale blue of a world that had been scoured clean and was now very cold and very still. Caleb was awake when Evelyn came down. She had heard him moving in the night, not loudly, but the house had a way of carrying sound through its old bones, and she was a light sleeper on the best nights. She'd lain in her room, listening to the careful, halting movement of a man trying to navigate a dark hallway on an ankle that didn't want to cooperate. She'd made herself stay in bed because going out would embarrass him, and embarrassment would make him harder to manage in the morning. He was at the kitchen table when she came in, his legs stretched out under it, coffee already made. He had gotten dressed, which given the ankle was a more considerable achievement than it sounds. He looked tired in the specific way of a person who has not slept as much as they should have and is not planning to admit it. Poured her coffee and sat. The cattle made it through, he said. I heard Pete moving around. No losses. Good, she said. Pause. The north fence section is going to need full replacement, he said. Not repair. The posts went down under the weight and some of them snapped. I'll write to the supplier in Casper today, she said. We have enough in the operating account. He looked at his cup. She could see him working through something, the precise expression of a man who has a thing to say and is deciding on the approach. You shouldn't have come out in that storm, he said. She had expected this. You keep saying that, she said. Keeps being true. You were down in the north pasture with 11 head of cattle and a bad leg in a blizzard, she said. What was the alternative? Waiting, he said. For how long? Didn't answer that. I used a rope, she said, for the second time in 12 hours. I wasn't reckless. I was careful and specific, and I found you. Looked at her across the table. I know, he said. That's not... He stopped. I'm not saying you did it wrong. I'm saying... He stopped again, which was unusual for him. He was a man who, when he spoke, generally knew where the sentence was going. I'm saying I don't take it lightly. What you did. She looked at him. Most people wouldn't have, he said. In that weather. With a child in the house. Dora was with Rosie, she said. That's not the point. I know it's not the point, she said more quietly. I know what the point is. Kitchen was warm and still around them, the pale morning light coming through the south windows. She could hear the distant sound of Pete and the hands starting the day's work outside, the ordinary sounds of a ranch morning after a storm. Thank you, he said again, as he had in the barn. This time it was different, less raw, more deliberate, the thanks of a man who has had the night to think about what he's grateful for and has decided it is more than the obvious thing. She nodded once and drank her coffee. He did not stay off the ankle for 2 weeks. He stayed off it for 4 days, which was longer than she'd expected and shorter than Pete had specified. And on the 5th day, he was moving around the ranch again with a walking stick he'd found in the hall closet and a careful gait that suggested he was managing the pain by not acknowledging it in the presence of anyone who might use it against him. She did not argue. She had seen enough of how he moved through the world to know that keeping him contained to the house for 10 more days was not a project she could win. Spending energy on a losing project was something she'd stopped doing 2 years ago out of simple necessity. What changed in those 4 days was something she hadn't prepared for. Caleb, confined to the house, was a different kind of company than Caleb passing through it. He was present in a sustained way she hadn't experienced yet, and the quality of that presence was she found herself not having the right word for it, which was unusual. Gree, he read. He had a shelf of books in the front room that she hadn't examined closely, and she found, watching him choose from it, on the first afternoon of his confinement, books were not decorative. Spines were worn. He had opinions about what he was looking for, and found it after a minute of considered selection. He and Rosie, with the particular perversity of circumstance, became something in those 4 days that they hadn't been before. Started with the books. Rosie, who was deeply curious about everything in the house that she had not yet fully examined, noticed him reading on the second afternoon and came into the front room with the sideways approach of a child testing whether she's welcome. Looked up. She stopped. He looked back at his book, then back at her. There's one on that lower shelf, he said with a green cover. As pictures. Rosie looked at the shelf, found the green cover, pulled it out. It was a natural history book, old and beautifully illustrated, with engravings of animals from across the continent. She sat on the floor near his chair, not next to him. Not quite, but in the same room, in a way that was a concession without being a commitment, and opened it. Sat like that for an hour. Talking, mostly, except when Rosie found something that required comment, which she addressed to the book rather than to him, in the way children have of speaking to the air when they don't want to seem like they're asking. These aren't real, she said, about an engraving of a buffalo herd that covered an entire page. They are, Caleb said, without looking up from his own book. A pause. There were that many more, he said, before. He turned a page. When I was young, there were still substantial herds. Not like that picture, but many. Rosie looked at the engraving for a long time. What happened to them? He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense he was deciding how much truth was appropriate for the ears of a 5-year-old. People, he said finally, which was accurate and incomplete in the way that some truths are. Rosie accepted this with the solemnity it deserved. She looked at the picture a while longer, then carefully turned the page. Evelyn, who had been standing in the doorway for the last several minutes, without either of them noticing, went back to the office. She sat at the desk for a moment without doing anything in particular. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the supply correspondence. On the 3rd day of Caleb's confinement, she found the flour. She was reorganizing the pantry, a project she'd been putting off since January, when she'd first realized that Dora's organizational system, while functional, was not a system so much as an accumulated archaeology of however things had arrived over the years. She was moving a sack of cornmeal when she found behind it 3 sacks of good flour that had not been on the supply manifest. She looked at them for a moment, brought one out and read the marking on the sack. It was from the Casper Mill good quality, not the cheaper Dunmore variety. She checked the manifest again. Not there, she asked Dora. Dora looked at the flour sack with an expression that was briefly, carefully neutral. That came in with the February order, she said. It's not on the manifest, Evelyn said. No, Dora agreed. It wouldn't be. Evelyn looked at her. Dora. Dora set down the pot she was holding and folded her hands, which was the particular posture she adopted when she'd decided to say a thing she'd been sitting on for a while. Family, she said. The Aldersons. Farm about 3 miles east of the Dunmore Road. Father broke his leg in the early winter, a bad break. He's been unable to work since November. There's a wife and 4 children. Mr. Rourke arranged for flour and cornmeal and some salt pork to go to them through the February supply order. Does this? She paused. He does this periodically. Various families. He doesn't put it in the manifest because he doesn't want it in the accounts. Evelyn stood very still. How long has he been doing this? She said. Since I've been here, Dora said. 11 years. A pause. Henderson's, the winter of 82. The Kraft widow, 84 and 85. Vasquez family last year when the father was sick. There are others. I don't know all of them. She picked up the pot again. Doesn't talk about it. He'd prefer you didn't either. Evelyn looked at the flour sack in her hands. Put it back, Dora said, not unkindly. And write it on the manifest as a supply variance. You'll understand what that means. She put it back. She wrote supply variance. February approved in the manifest with no further notation, which was the polite fiction that would allow the accounts to balance, and Caleb to believe she hadn't looked too closely. She was aware, putting her pen down, that she was sitting with something that was changing the shape of what she understood about this man. Not dramatically, it was not a sudden revelation. It was more like a picture coming into resolution, like standing close to something and stepping back and seeing it whole for the first time. She thought about the morning after she arrived, Caleb looking at Rosie asleep at the table and saying, "A child that tired hasn't been comfortable in a long time." She thought about the chair from the front room that had appeared in the office without explanation. She thought about the way he spoke to Rosie like a person, not a fixture, not a problem to be managed. She thought about the way he'd said, "Your situation is understood" in a letter to a stranger. She thought about 11 years of flour and cornmeal going to families who couldn't afford either, unrecorded, unannounced, with no expectation of return. She sat at the desk in the office for a long time. She did not say anything to him that day or the next. Gah, she thought about it. She turned over various approaches, direct, indirect, mentioning the manifest notation, saying nothing at all, and discarded each of them for reasons that were easier to name than the actual reason, which was that the thing she wanted to say was not actually about flour. It was Rosie, in the end, who broke it open. On the 4th evening, Caleb was in the front room with his leg up and the natural history book in his lap, and Rosie had brought her own books, the 3 she'd packed from the cabin. Worn soft from handling and settled on the rug near him with the casual ownership of a child who has decided a space is safe. Evelyn was at the kitchen table reviewing the supply correspondence when she heard Rosie say, clearly and without preamble, "My papa had a gold watch." "A pause, Diddy," Caleb said. "Picture inside the cover," Rosie said, "of Mama and me. Small picture." A pause. She sold it for medicine. "When I was sick." Evelyn went completely still at the kitchen table. "No, she was sad about it," Rosie continued, with the matter-of-fact quality she had when she was reporting something she understood to be significant, but didn't have the full emotional vocabulary for yet. "She thought I didn't see, but I did." Silence from the front room. "It was a good watch," Rosie said. "Papa said it kept perfect time." Evelyn pressed her hand flat on the table and stared at the supply correspondence without reading it. She did not hear Caleb respond, if he responded. What she heard, a moment later, was the sound of the front room being quiet in the particular way rooms are quiet when something important has just been said, and everyone in them is sitting with it. She did not go in. She stayed at the kitchen table until she heard Rosie's voice again, asking something about the buffalo engraving, and the conversation moved on, and she breathed. 3 days later, she found the watch. It was on the desk in the office when she came in after breakfast, set in the center of the desk, on top of the supply manifest she'd been working from, as if it had been placed there deliberately, and with some thought about where she would most certainly see it. A small round gold watch, worn smooth on the edges from years of handling, with a chain that had been recently repaired. She could see the new link, slightly brighter than the rest. She picked it up. The cover opened the way it always had, a small resistance, then a clean release, and inside the lid was the photograph. Thomas and herself, younger by 5 years, in the stiff formal posture of people being photographed who are also trying not to look terrified of the camera. Rosie was not in this one. It predated Rosie, but Rosie had remembered it as having her in it, which was the particular alchemy of childhood memory, turning things into what they meant rather than what they were. She stood in the office holding her dead husband's watch for a long time. She had sold it in October 8 months ago to a traveling merchant who had come through Cody County on his way north. He had paid her $3 for it, which she had known was a fraction of its value, and had accepted anyway because Rosie's fever had been high for 4 days, and the medicine from the doctor in town required payment up front. She had closed the door of the cabin after the merchant left, and held herself together by sheer force of will, and then Rosie had called from the back room, and she'd gone to her, and that had been that. She did not know how he had found it. A watch sold to a traveling merchant 8 months ago in a different county could have gone anywhere. It could have moved through 3 more sets of hands before reaching wherever Caleb had located it. The effort required to trace it, to know where to look, to find the right person, to pay whatever had been asked without negotiating, because she was certain from the condition of the watch that he had not negotiated, was a kind of effort she had not asked for and could not have anticipated. Closed the cover. She found him at the north fence line, which Pete had told her that morning he was inspecting despite the ankle, still not being entirely reliable on uneven ground. She walked out to him a quarter mile across the pasture. In the thin April morning, the ground soft now, the last of the winter finally releasing its grip on the soil. Saw her coming, and she saw him red, from whatever distance he first spotted her, that something had shifted. He waited. She stopped in front of him and held out the watch. "You didn't have to do this," she said. He looked at the watch, not at her. "I know," he said. "How did you find it?" "The merchant who bought it from you came through Larder Valley in December," he said. He'd sold it by then, but he remembered where. It took some letters. A pause. Took some time. December. He had started looking for it in December. She had arrived in February. He had been looking for this watch before she'd set foot on his land, which meant he'd been looking for it, based on nothing but a letter from a widow who mentioned, in the honest accounting of herself that she'd written by lamplight in a failing cabin, that her husband was gone. She had not mentioned the watch in the letter. She didn't know how he'd known. "I didn't tell you about it," she said. "No," he said. "Then how—" "You told me your husband was a decent man," he said. "Decent man with a family usually has something." He looked at the watch now briefly. "I wrote to the county office when I paid your taxes. Asked if there were any records of sales made that winter in the area." A pause. Merchant had signed a receipt. They keep them sometimes. She stared at him. It seemed like a thing that mattered, he said, with the slight difficulty of a man explaining something he'd done on instinct and is now being asked to translate into language. She looked down at the watch in her palm. The gold of it caught the thin morning light and held it. "Does matter," she said. She looked up at him, and she did not manage to keep everything off her face that she'd spent months keeping off her face, because there was only so much management a person was capable of, and she had used most of it up. It mattered very much. He looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things that were important to him. He didn't look away. "I should tell you something," she said. "All right. I know about the flower," she said. "The Alderson family. Others." She paused. "Dora told me not to expose you to explain why the manifest didn't balance. I wrote it as a variance." He was quiet. 11 years, she said. Said nothing for a moment. "Then it's not a notable thing." "It is," she said. "Don't tell me it isn't." He looked out across the pasture with the expression of a man who is genuinely uncomfortable being seen clearly. "Practical," he said. "If the families around you fail, the valley fails." "It's in my interest to Caleb," she said. He stopped. "You tracked down a $3 watch that belonged to a dead man you never met," she said. "Don't tell me it's practical." He stood with that for a moment. On the wind came across the pasture and moved the grass in long, slow rolls. And the fence line stretched out beside them with the new posts sharp and pale against the old ones. "I placed that advertisement," he said slowly, "because I was tired of coming home to an empty house." He said it the way a man says a thing he has not said out loud before, carefully, like he's testing whether the words hold the weight of the actual feeling. "I told myself it was practical. A housekeeper. Someone to manage what I couldn't manage. I told myself that for 2 months after I placed it." A pause. "Then your letter came." She waited. "You wrote about your daughter," he said. "You wrote about her before you wrote about yourself." That was. He stopped. "I don't know how to explain what that was." He looked at her directly. "I just knew that the house wasn't going to be empty anymore." She looked at him for a long time. There were things she could say. Careful things and honest things, and things that required more courage than she was certain she had available on a Tuesday morning in April, standing in a muddy pasture with a gold watch in her hand. She thought about Thomas, who had been decent and good. She thought about the letter she had written by lamplight in a failing cabin. She thought about Rosie saying, "You always come back," with her face pressed against a coat. "I should get back," she said. The supply correspondence. "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. He did not say anything else for a moment. He looked at her with that direct, particular attention. She realized she had stopped moving. She was standing still in the way she stood still when Winter pressed his forehead against her collarbone, not paralyzed, but present, fully present, the watch warm in her closed hand. "I know you didn't come here for me," he said. You came here because you had no other choice and you were trying to take care of your daughter. I understand that completely." A pause. "But somewhere in the last 3 months," he looked at the pasture. Back at her. "I stopped thinking about this as an arrangement." Wind moved across the grass. She did not say, "I know." She did not say, "So did I." She did not say any of the things that were stacking up behind her teeth, because saying them meant something she had not fully decided she was ready for yet. What she said was, "Give me time." He looked at her. "I'm not saying no," she said. "I'm saying give me time to figure out what I'm saying yes to. The last time I made a decision about my life in a hurry, I did it from desperation, and I don't want—" She stopped. "I don't want to do this from desperation. I want to do it from something better than that." Nodded once. Slow, complete, without argument. "All right," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she looked down at the watch in her palm one more time, closed her fingers around it, and turned back toward the house. That one. She walked across the pasture in the April morning with the watch held in her hand and the grass bending around her boots in the wind, and she did not look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she was doing the thing she'd told Rosie about, knowing what you were going to say, gone and saying it, and then walking forward. Behind her, she heard him begin the slow, careful walk back toward the fence line, grass moving around him as he went. Watch kept perfect time. Time, it turned out, was not an abstract thing. It had texture, it had weight, it moved differently, depending on what you were doing with it. Evelyn had asked for it standing in a muddy pasture with a gold watch in her hand. Caleb had given it without condition. And now April was becoming May, and the valley was turning green in the slow, incremental way of high country springs a little more each morning, a little more warmth in the afternoon light, and she was still inside the time she'd asked for, still turning the question over, still not entirely certain what the answer was made of. This was not dishonesty. She had been honest with him about needing it, and she was honest with herself about why. She had been a wife before. She had loved Thomas in the particular, practical way of two people who chose each other young and grew into the choice, not the blazing kind of love that belongs to songs and bad poetry, but the real kind that shows up when the food runs out and the medicine doesn't work, and you're still there, still trying. She knew what it cost to build a life with another person. She knew what it cost to lose it, and she was not willing to step into a second one from desperation, or from gratitude, or from the simple, seductive comfort of feeling safe for the first time in 2 years. She wanted to step into it, if she stepped into it, from something clear. In the meantime, the ranch was doing well. The north fence was repaired. The east pasture drainage had been cleared properly in late March, and the lower pasture had stayed dry through the thaw, which saved 2 months of grazing capacity that they'd have otherwise lost. Supply accounts were in order organized, cross-referenced, honest, and the relationship with the Casper vendors, which Caleb had been managing through a series of irregular letters that committed to nothing and confused everything, been renegotiated into 3 stable contracts with delivery schedules that actually matched the ranch's seasonal needs. Pratt's Mercantile had not overcharged them since February. Evelyn noticed this in the April invoice without commenting on it, noted it in the accounts, and moved on. Caleb said nothing about the April pasture conversation. He did not press her, did not find reasons to revisit it, did not create the particular pressured atmosphere of a man waiting for an answer he's decided he's owed. He was simply there, in the same way he'd always been there, working his land, feeding his cattle, coming in at the end of the day with mud on his boots and wind in his coat, saying what needed to be said about the ranch and not filling the silence with noise when there was nothing that needed saying. She respected this more than she could easily express. What she did not expect was what happened in the first week of May, when Dunmore decided it had been quiet long enough. She was in town alone on a Wednesday. Caleb was at the south fence. Rosie was with Dora picking up a package from the post office that contained the revised Casper supply contracts. She had the package under her arm and was crossing the main street toward the wagon when Agnes Belmore appeared from the direction of the dressmakers, not by accident. No, you could tell it wasn't by accident, because Agnes Belmore moved with the particular purposefulness of a woman who has positioned herself somewhere, and is now performing the discovery of the person she positioned herself to encounter. Mrs. Hart, Agnes said, stopping directly in her path with a smile that was doing considerable work. I haven't seen you in weeks. I've been busy, Evelyn said. Kept a pleasant face on, because she was on a public street, and pleasantness on a public street was both pragmatic and cheaper than conflict. I imagine so. Agnes glanced at the package under Evelyn's arm. Getting settled in out there. Managing the accounts, Evelyn said. Yes. Agnes clasped her hands in front of her. We were talking, several of us, just this week, about how things stand. Between you and Caleb Rourke. She paused with the timing of someone who has rehearsed the pause. It's been 3 months now, hasn't it? And no formalization. Some people have begun to wonder whether the arrangement is another pause. Appropriate. 2 men on the porch outside Pratt's store were not looking at them, which meant they were listening carefully. Appropriate, Evelyn repeated. A single woman, Agnes said, living in a man's home. Child. She tilted her head slightly. Without the proper standing that a marriage would provide. People talk, Mrs. Hart. I'm sure you know that. I do know that, Evelyn said. People in this valley have been talking since the day I arrived. I've noticed it doesn't require much provocation. Agnes's smile went slightly fixed. The arrangement, Evelyn said, is between Mr. Rourke and myself. My standing in his household is that of a working woman who is paid for her labor and who keeps her own land in her own name. If the valley finds that arrangement troubling, I'd be interested to understand which part specifically, the working, the paying, or the land ownership. One of the men on the porch had stopped pretending to look elsewhere. I only mean, Agnes began. I know what you mean, Evelyn said, with the steadiness she had developed over 4 months of needing it. I'm choosing to hear it as concern for my welfare and to thank you for it accordingly. She shifted the package under her arm. Good morning, Mrs. Belmore. She went to the wagon. She was halfway back to the ranch before her hands stopped being tight on the reins. Not because it had frightened her, because it hadn't, entirely, and she was tired of it costing her anything at all. She was tired of calibrating herself against the valley's opinion of what a woman, in her position, was supposed to be grateful enough to be manageable, independent enough to be respected, but not so independent that it made anyone uncomfortable. She was tired of the arithmetic of it. She was tired in the way you get tired of a thing that has been going on long enough to become simply the weather of your life, and you realize one day that you have the option to go inside. She thought about this on the road. Wagon wheels turning in the ruts left by the spring thaw, the valley green and wide around her. Somewhere in those 3 miles, she stopped being tired and started being clear. She found Caleb at the barn when she got back. He was with Pete, looking at one of the yearlings that had been moving strangely for 2 days. She could see, from the set of his shoulders and the way Pete was talking, that the news was not good. She put the wagon away, took the supply contracts inside, and waited. Came in about an hour later, sat at the kitchen table. Dora handed him coffee without being asked and took Rosie to the back garden, which was Dora's way of clearing a room without making anything of it. Yearling? Evelyn said. Front left. Pete thinks it's been a slow injury, something in the joint. She won't be breeding stock. He drank his coffee. He was looking at the table, not at her, with the expression of a working rancher absorbing a practical loss. I'm sorry, she said. He shook his head slightly. Part of it. How was town? She sat across from him. Agnes Belmore found me on the main street. He was still. She raised the question of propriety, Evelyn said. Our arrangement, whether it was appropriate, given that there has been no formalization. Set his cup down with a careful deliberateness that suggested the flatness in his face was doing work. What did you say? I said it was between us, she said. True. She looked at him. But it made me think about something on the way home. He waited. She pressed her hands flat on the table, the same gesture she'd made in the office months ago, steadying herself against an unsteady thing, and then she stopped, because she wasn't unsteady. That was the thing she had worked out on the road. She wasn't unsteady anymore. I asked you for time, she said. And you gave it, and I needed it. I needed to know that I wasn't saying yes to something because I was afraid of saying no. I needed to know the difference between choosing you and just choosing safety. She paused. Those aren't the same thing. No, he said, they're not. I know the difference now, she said. He looked at her across the table, and his face did the thing it sometimes did, open slightly, like a Door that has been held shut by long habit and is now being let go an inch. I'm not saying yes, because Agnes Belmore embarrassed me on the main street, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm saying yes, because I've been watching you for 4 months, and what I see is someone worth choosing. For the right reasons. She paused. That's different from what I had before, by the way. I loved Thomas, but I was 22, and I chose him partly because the world told me that was the next thing you did. This is different. I know exactly what I'm choosing and why. He was very still. I would like to actually marry you, she said. Not for the arrangement. Not for the town. For the reasons that matter. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. She could see something moving through his face, not performance. Not relief exactly. But the specific expression of a man who has held himself carefully in check for a long time and has just been told he can put the weight down. All right, he said. She almost laughed, all right? I mean, yes, he said, with a slight roughness in his voice that she had not heard before. I mean, yes. I know what you meant, she said. They sat at the kitchen table in the midday quiet, and it was not a romantic moment in the way stories usually render romantic moments. There was no particular grandeur to it. No speech. No sweeping gesture. It was just two people sitting across from each other who had arrived at the same place by different roads and by a considerable amount of hard, unglamorous work, and who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what the other was made of, including the difficult parts. She thought that was probably better. Wedding took place on a Saturday in late May, at the ranch, in the front room that Evelyn had cleaned and repaired and made into a livable space over the course of 4 months. Judge who performed the ceremony rode out from Dunmore and was clearly curious and professional enough not to show it openly. Pete and 2 of the other hands were present. Dora stood near the kitchen doorway with her arms folded and the expression of a woman who is not going to cry and is working hard to maintain that position. Rosie stood beside Evelyn. She was wearing the dress Dora had helped her alter 3 weeks earlier, a serious project, undertaken with the gravity appropriate to important work, and she had her dark hair braided the way she liked it. She held Evelyn's hand throughout the ceremony, with the firm, steady grip of a child who is not nervous, but is paying very close attention to everything. When the judge finished and Caleb and Evelyn signed the register, Rosie looked up at Caleb with an expression that Evelyn would remember for the rest of her life, not a child performing a moment, but a small person who has been watching carefully for a long time and has arrived at a conclusion. Are you my father now? Rosie asked. The room went briefly very quiet. Caleb crouched down to her level, which, given the ankle, was still an act of effort, and he looked at her directly. The way he looked at things he considered important. I'm whoever you want me to be, he said. I won't tell you what to call me. That's yours to decide. Rosie thought about this with her characteristic seriousness. I'll think about it, she said. Take your time, he said. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to find Dora to ask about the food. Caleb straightened up and looked at Evelyn, and there was something in his face that she understood was the feeling a person has when a thing they did not dare fully hope for happens anyway. She took his hand. The Valley's reaction to the marriage was divided, which was both predictable and beside the point. There were people who came around. The Alderson family, the farmer, whose leg had kept him out of work through the winter. The family who had received Caleb's unannounced flower sent a letter that arrived on the second Tuesday after the wedding. The wife had written it. A short letter, neat and plain, that said they had heard the news and wished them well and were grateful, in ways they couldn't fully express, for the winter that had passed. Evelyn read it twice and put it in the desk drawer, in the same place where she kept Thomas's letters and the receipt from the county land office and the repaired watch chain. Agnes Belmore did not come around. Exactly. But she stopped making appearances in front of other people to voice concern, which was its own kind of coming around. Pratt remained Pratt. He continued to send accurate invoices. Del Harker avoided the ranch and, as far as Evelyn could tell, avoided Evelyn specifically in town, which suited her fine. She had no particular need to resolve things with Del Harker. Some things don't resolve, they just recede to a manageable distance, and that's sufficient. What happened in town, the third Saturday after the wedding, was not something she had planned for. She and Caleb were in Dunmore for together, as they had been periodically since her arrival, but it was different now in the specific way that everything is different when the relationship underneath a thing changes. Ply Run was the same. The wagon was the same. But she was not Mrs. Hart, the woman from the mail order advertisement. And she was not the woman in Rourke's house with all the ambiguity that phrase had carried for 4 months. She was simply here with her husband, doing what needed to be done. They were loading the wagon outside Pratt's when Harker appeared on the street. He was with 2 other men she recognized from the day they'd come to the ranch Lowell, Pratt's assistant, and the younger man she still didn't know the name of. Harker looked at the wagon, looked at Caleb, and then looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man recalculating something. He said nothing. Caleb had seen him. She felt it, the particular stillness that moved through Caleb when he was deciding something. She kept loading supplies and waited. Caleb set down the sack he was carrying and turned to face Harker directly. "Dell," he said. Harker nodded. "I think you know my wife," Caleb said. Words sat on the street between all of them. Not aggressively, he didn't say it as a challenge, precisely, though it was also precisely that. Said it the way you state a fact when the fact is the entire point. Harker looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him, pleasantly and without any particular energy. "Mrs. Rourke," Harker said, after a moment, with the stiffness of a man performing a courtesy he hasn't decided to mean yet. "Mr. Harker," she said. He moved on, so did Lowell. Younger man glanced back once and then didn't. Caleb picked up his sack and turned back to the wagon. She was already loading the next item. They worked for a minute in silence. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I can manage, Harker. I know that too," he said. Set the sack in the wagon bed and looked at her. "I didn't do it because you couldn't manage him. I did it because it was true, and he needed to hear it from me directly." And he paused. "I'm tired of watching people in this valley treat you like a problem someone made rather than a person who chose to be here." She looked at him. "You came 3 days on horseback in February cold," he said, with a flatness that was not coldness but conviction. "Pulled me out of a blizzard with a rope tied to a barn door. You reorganized 4 years of neglected accounts and recovered money I'd been losing for years and kept a 5-year-old fed and calm through all of it. That deserves to be named. Not by me making a speech in the street. Just," he looked at the wagon, "by people knowing who you are." She stood with that for a moment. "You're not bad at speeches," she said. Corner of his mouth moved. "Don't tell anyone." She picked up the next sack. "I'll put it in the accounts as a variance." Made the sound that she now recognized. Certainty, as a laugh short real, reluctant in the way of someone who hasn't laughed, often enough to be comfortable with it. Finished loading the wagon and drove home. Summer came fully in June. The ranch in summer was a different animal than the ranch in winter, not easier exactly, but less brutal. The work shifted from survival to production, from holding what you had to building what you wanted. Cattle were moved to the high summer pasture. The lower pasture was left to rest and recover. The accounts reflected. For the first time in the years, Evelyn could reconstruct from the records. A ranch that was not just solvent, but genuinely stable reserves adequate for a bad winter. Contracts with suppliers that locked in fair prices. Supply system that did not depend on one person remembering everything because it was written down in a form anyone with basic literacy could follow. She told Caleb this on a July evening, at the kitchen table, going over the quarterly summary. He looked at the figures for a moment. "You built this," he said. "We built it," she said. "The accounts reflect the operation. If the operation was bad, the accounts would show it. The operation was fine before you arrived. The operation was adequate," she said, with the tone she used when she was being precise on purpose. Fine and adequate are different things. He looked at her with the slight expression that meant he was deciding whether to argue and had concluded it wasn't worth it. She had learned to read this expression early and found it reliable. "What does the east pasture drainage look like going into fall?" she asked. He told her. And they talked about the ranch for another hour. And it was the kind of conversation that looks mundane from the outside but is not mundane at all. It is 2 people building something together, in real time, from the materials of an ordinary Tuesday evening. Rosie appeared in the doorway at some point in her nightgown, with the look of a child who has been almost asleep and then thought of something important. "I decided," she said to Caleb. He looked up. "What to call you," she said. He waited. "Caleb," she said, "because that's your name." She paused, with the logic of a 6-year-old who has thought this through carefully. "Papa was what I called my papa. That was his, your Caleb. Different, but it's still yours." He was quiet for a moment. "Works for me," he said. Rosie nodded, satisfied, and went back to bed. Evelyn looked at the quarterly summary and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the room hadn't already held. In August, she rode back to see the 40 acres. She went alone. Gone Winter, who was fully recovered and had been for months the strong, careful horse he had always been. Restored by 2 months of rest and Pete's attentive care and the particular stubbornness that had always been his best quality. She rode the 43 miles over 2 days, which felt very different in August than it had felt in February. The cabin was standing. The lock she had put on it had held. Inside, the rooms were cold and dim and smelled of disuse, the particular smell of a place that has been waiting. She walked through it slowly, touching things: the kitchen shelf, the table, windowsill where the cracked teacup had stood. She went outside and walked the 40 acres. Eastern Quarter had the dark, deep soil Thomas had always talked about, and she stood in it and felt it under her boots and thought about what he'd said. We can get through enough winters. We'll have something worth having. They had gotten through enough winters. She had anyway. In a form he hadn't planned for, on a road he hadn't foreseen, she had come out the other side of enough winters, and she had something worth having. Land was hers. It would stay hers. She had decided during the ride what she wanted to do with it. She told Caleb when she got back. They were sitting on the porch in the evening light, a thing they did sometimes. Now in the summer, when the heat of the day had eased and the valley smelled of grass and distance. Rosie was inside with Dora. The mountains to the north were still lit along their tops. I want to use the east pasture for horses, she said. Old ones, injured ones, ones that would otherwise be destroyed. Not a large operation. Just she thought about Winter, standing at the gate in February with his legs wrong and his head down, and Pete staying through the night to see what he had left. Just a place for them. Caleb looked at her. It would cost something to set up, she said. Fencing repairs, a shelter. I have some money saved from my wages here, but not enough to cover the full. I'll cover it, he said. Caleb, it's a good use of the land, he said. It's not charity you'll take in horses that have nowhere else to go, which means fewer animals being put down, which is a practical benefit to any rancher in the valley who doesn't want to make that call. He paused. It suits you. It suits me, she agreed. Then it's settled, he said. It was settled. Not smoothly, the fencing repairs took until September, and the shelter was incomplete when the first old horse arrived and had to be finished in sections while the animal was already in residence and had opinions about the hammering. First horse was a chestnut gelding, 17 years old, with a quarter crack in his front hoof that his previous owner had decided made him more trouble than he was worth. Evelyn named him July, which was when he arrived, and he was cantankerous and difficult, and she liked him immediately. Winter tolerated July with the dignified resignation of an animal who has decided the newcomer isn't worth a confrontation, but also doesn't need to be friendly. By October, there were 3 horses on the east pasture. By the following spring, there were 7. People in the valley who needed somewhere to put an animal they couldn't use and couldn't bring themselves to destroy began to know about the 40 acres, and word moved in the slow, reliable way of useful information in small communities. It's a thing that happens. Sometimes. People who have been through genuine difficulty, not the difficulty that tests you and reveals your strength, which is how stories usually frame it, but the grinding, unspectacular kind that just erodes you day after day until you're not sure how much of yourself is left. Evelyn Hart had been through that kind, the kind that doesn't leave you stronger in any immediately obvious way, kind that leaves you cautious, careful, you're slow to trust, inclined to calculate the cost of everything before you reach for it. She did not emerge from it transformed into someone easier or softer or more readily open. She remained what difficulty had made her. Practical, direct, capable of managing hostile rooms, inclined to think 3 steps ahead, not given to expressions of feeling that she hadn't fully worked out. These were not romantic qualities. They were survival qualities, and they had not stopped being necessary just because the immediate emergency was over. What she had found, and what she had not expected to find, was a man who did not require her to be otherwise. Caleb Rourke was not an easy man. He was not warm in the demonstrative sense. He had his own long habits of solitude and his own economy with language and his own way of showing care that bypassed declaration entirely and went straight to action: a fixed latch, a repaired watch. 60 days of letters to find something a woman had sold for $3 to save her daughter's life. He was imperfect in the specific ways that a man who has lived too long without anyone to push back on him is imperfect. He was occasionally inflexible, occasionally too certain, occasionally inclined to take a fence apart and rebuild it himself rather than asking for help when asking would have been faster. He did not always know when he was being hard, and when he was being fair, and sometimes could not tell the difference until someone told him. She told him when he needed it. He listened. Not always immediately. But he listened. He changed what he could change. And he was honest about what he couldn't, which she considered sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was more than most people managed. She had understood, by the second winter, that February marking 1 full year since she had arrived at the gate in the snow with a sick horse and a hungry child, and nothing left was this: love, the real kind. It's not a feeling that arrives. It is a thing that builds. It builds the way a ranch builds, through work that is sometimes hard and unglamorous and cold and discouraging. The result of all that work is not perfect, and it is not frictionless, and it requires maintenance and perpetuity, and none of that means it isn't real. What she had with Caleb was real. It had been assembled from $40 tax debts and supply manifests, and a rope tied to a barn door in a blizzard, and a gold watch on a desk in an office, and a 5-year-old child who had decided that the word Caleb was its own thing, and didn't need to be anything else to be important. It was not what she had planned. She had planned to survive. She had planned to keep her daughter fed and her land safe and herself intact. She had not planned for any of the rest of it, but she had stopped being surprised, somewhere in the second year, by the fact that the best things in her life had not been planned. They had been chosen in full knowledge, with clear eyes, from something better than desperation. The difference. That was the thing she had needed the time to find. Watch still kept perfect time. She kept it in the office, on the corner of the desk, where she could see it while she worked. It had been Thomas's, and it was also hers. And it was also part of a story that had turned out to be longer, and stranger and more survivable than she had believed in February of the previous year, when a deputy had kicked her door open and told her she had 5 days. 5 days, 5 months, 5 years. She was still counting. She supposed was the whole point. On a morning in the 2nd February, she came downstairs before dawn to find the fire already built up and the coffee made, and Caleb's boots by the door. He had gone out to the pasture, as he always did, because the cattle needed seeing to, and the morning did not wait on preference. She poured her coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the pale beginning of the day, at the barn and the pasture beyond it, and the faint shapes of horses in the east field, 7 of them now, 7 animals that had been given up on, moving slowly in the thin morning light. She heard Rosie's feet on the stairs, the particular small thunder of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to come downstairs quietly, and then Rosie was in the kitchen, hair loose, face still soft from sleep, going directly to the window to look at the horses the way she did every morning. "July's by the fence again," Rosie said. "He likes the fence," Evelyn said. "He's watching for something," Rosie said with authority. She had opinions about what the horses were doing and why. Evelyn had stopped questioning whether a 6-year-old's horse psychology was reliable, because Rosie was, on balance, more often right than wrong. "Think he's watching for?" Evelyn asked. Rosie considered the chestnut gelding shape in the pale morning light with the seriousness she brought to important questions. "I think he's just making sure it's still there," she said. "The land, in case it went away in the night." Evelyn looked at her daughter. "Didn't," Evelyn said. "I know," Rosie said. "But he checks anyway." She picked up her coffee and looked back out the window at the horses in the field at July by the fence, checking on the land that was still there. Renwinter standing further back with his pale coat catching the first thin light, and the 5 others moving in the quiet morning between them. The land was still there. She checked on it too every morning in her own way. She supposed she always would. That was not a wound. That was simply the shape of what it meant to have lost something and found it again. You learned to look for it, and you kept looking, and every morning it was still there, was a morning that counted. Outside, across the pasture, she could see Caleb's shape moving along the fence line in the early light, checking, working, present. She watched him for a moment, this man who had said your situation is understood to a stranger in a letter, and had meant it in ways that went further than either of them had known at the time. Then she turned to her daughter. "Get your coat," she said. "Come see the horses with me." Rosie was already reaching for it.